Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining today's webinar, Voices of Equity. I'm Lisa Wilding Brown, Chief Research Officer here at Innovate MR. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Innovate, we are a global sampling firm and field services agency. We have an awesome crowd joining us today on the line, and our team is super excited to share findings from a recent study that the Multicultural Insights Collective conducted. So before we start into today's presentation, just a few quick housekeeping items as people are logging in today. This session will be recorded, and we will plan to send out a recording to all those who have registered for the webinar. And then also, this is a live webinar, which is super great. And if you have questions as we're presenting, feel free to add those questions into the nav bar. And if we can't get to it straight away, we'll make sure to cover it during our panel discussion. So with further ado, let's jump right in. So this year has proven to be a very challenging one on many fronts for Americans. A new challenge for us was, of course, the global pandemic, but one challenge that is not new is the deep divide in social justice and racial equity experienced by so many of our fellow Americans. While this issue is not new, it has come to the forefront like really never before, brought about by several tragic events, including the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among countless others. Earlier this year and throughout the summer, thousands of Americans hit the streets to really demonstrate the deep injustice that has continued to ravage diverse groups for centuries. In recent months, we've seen a variety of brands embrace the narrative of these protests in their social media posts, in their corporate communication strategies, and employee diversity programming. Several months ago, my friend and fellow Wire exec colleague, Carrie Edelstein, and I were talking, and we had many conversations about the tragic events that had unfolded. And we came to the realization that simply disagreeing with injustice was not enough. Retweeting or resharing also felt really shallow and performative. In our minds, no material action was the same thing as being complicit to all of these horrible events. During these conversations, we recounted missteps that some really major brands had taken, as well as the utter silence coming from so many others, which got us thinking, how are brands navigating our current climate? Are they saying the right things? Are they saying the wrong things? Are they saying anything at all? And what are the right actions? And what do communities of color and other underrepresented groups truly want? How can we transform this moment into a movement? To start, we knew that we needed to assemble a diverse cross-section of peers who represent a multitude of different backgrounds, abilities, and personal experiences. As a collective, we would need to establish goals and take an insights-driven approach and evaluate complex topics like diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation. Our mission is simple: to help truly activate opportunities for professional and organizational development, and to help save brands from saying the wrong thing or from the conversational paralysis that so many in our space are struggling with today. Which leads us here, the Multicultural Insights Collective. You'll be meeting several of us in today's presentation and panel discussion. This is the first of many research projects intended to break down walls and truly activate learnings into meaningful and material change. And we have 3 goals for today. Number 1, distill the most important socio-political issues across all Americans and across different demographic groups. Understand how different cohorts take advocacy action and the role different media platforms play in this. And lastly, learn the language and terminology both being used and understood or not. So before we get started, let's take a look at the methodology of our study. This was a quantitative study optimized for both mobile and desktop participants. We interviewed just over 1,000 respondents ages 18 to 74. It's important to note that we oversampled minority racial groups in order to secure a readable base. and then weighted the final data to ensure national representation. Additionally, we included both a race identification question as well as a Hispanic origin question, since being Hispanic is really more of a cultural designation versus a race. So we'll discuss that in a bit more detail later. And the study, I should note here, fielded in September of 2020 to help give everyone here a sense of context for timing. So today, Carrie and Damien will be reviewing some key themes from our research, and then we'll wrap it up by sharing information on how you all can get involved. And then Delphine will lead us in what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting panel discussion with some members from our collective. So with that, over to you, Carrie.
Thank you. So we're really excited to share some of our key insights from this study. And really, there are 5 prevailing themes we're going to talk about today. And I will caveat that by saying that this was a fairly extensive survey. So there's a lot more where this came from. And we're going to be continuing to glean information and share that out on social media and on our website, voicesofequity.com. But today is kind of a little bit of a teaser to whet your appetite on some of the things we've learned and where we're going to be going with that. So if you go to the next slide, Lisa. Really, there are 5 emerging themes that came out of this research. The first is that as Americans, we're all starting from differential starting points. So we can't really assume we're all coming from the same place when we start to have conversations around DEI. And that might sound intuitive, but we're going to talk about some specifics we learned around that. We also dove a little bit into hashtag advocacy and found that this idea of hashtagging for change can be both a friend and a foe. We'll talk a little bit about how that plays out. And then also how that plays out in media in general, where it's helping our relationships and where it's maybe not helping our relationships when it comes to these conversations. Then we're going to talk a little bit, and Damien's going to walk us through some vocabulary of DEI, what Americans understand, what vocabulary we're maybe using that isn't well known and might actually be accidentally exclusionary. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the dual meaning of equity and why that's part of our name. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start with our first point. One of the things that really stood out loud and clear to us as we dug into this research is that while as Americans, we care about a lot of the same things, right? COVID-19 relief, affordable healthcare, fighting hunger, education, things like that are generally pretty universal areas of interest. We're having a really tough time unifying for change when it comes to racial justice in particular. If you go to the next slide, one of the key headlines we learned out of this is that 2 in 5 Americans have actually severed ties or had ties severed with them with a friend or a family member over a current socio-political issue. 2 in 5 Americans have been willing to walk away from a friendship or family member. And I think probably a lot of people here are familiar with that and feel some of that. So why is that? You're probably not going to be surprised to learn what's driving that. Certainly the presidential election has been a big part of that and who is going to be president. The effectiveness of masks had been a big dividing cause as well. But one of our top 3 is violence and the perceived violence at Black Lives Matters protests. So we started asking ourselves, in this environment where people are really willing to walk away from friends and walk away from relationships and family members, how do we start to address racial justice and equity in this very tense environment where we're even severing close ties, let alone ties that are more professional in nature or might be a little bit less close to us? How do we even start having these conversations? And the first thing we really unraveled is that we need to recognize that we're all starting from different and varied emotional starting points. We asked about 20 different potential social causes in our study, and that ranged for everything from affordable healthcare to education, environmental protections, etc. And what we found is out of these 20 causes, Black Americans were most likely to rank police brutality and ending police brutality as their #1 most important social cause. And for those of you on the call who are our fellow methodology wonks, we did a max diff exercise to really level this up so that people couldn't choose everything's important. They actually had to pick what was most important to them, what they were most willing to advocate for. And that really rose to the surface among Black Americans. 24% picked it as their #1 cause. And that's consistent with other research. If any of you have been to some of the Insights Association presentations in the last few months, you know that BET did research around this earlier this year and found the same thing, that police brutality is the #1 most important election issue this year among Black America. And so we found that was quite consistent. But what's interesting is it ranks 4th overall. Now that's interesting, it ranks 4th out of 20 issues. That really means that this is a topic that's starting to surface as a priority in America, but it's most of a priority among Black Americans. We have to recognize that we're not actually starting from the same place there. The other aspect of this is that there's an emotional element to this. And we asked a whole battery of agree, disagree statements of our respondents, and we found that 2 in 3 Black Americans agree that police brutality has taken an emotional toll on me. And for reference point, the average was about 1 in 3. So they're twice as likely to say this has taken an emotional toll on me, right? This is something that I really think about, and emotional tolls can take a physical toll as well. So again, this is starting from a really different place. And if you go to the next slide, that plays out in this sense of not necessarily being able to trust police officers. And I will say we actually very consciously anchored our question around this to local police officers. And we asked people, agree or disagree? How much do you agree or disagree? I trust my local police officers to protect me, because localization tends to make things a little bit more close to home personally, and people tend to trust things that are closer to home. And we actually found there was a massive disparity here in terms of racial background when it comes to trusting police officers. And you can see among white Americans, 7 in 10 generally trust their local police officers to protect them, but only about 1 in 3 Black Americans feel that way, feel that can be trusted. The other thing I want to point out here is that we saw a pretty distinct difference when we broke out the Hispanic community into white Hispanics versus non-white Hispanics. And I'd love to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle, to talk a little bit about that and what we think is happening there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure, yes, we can.
That's great. We are having some technical issues today, so I'll make sure. So as you can see in this chart, the issue with the police has mainly to do with race. As you can see, the trust in the police gets lower as the skin gets darker, regardless of whether you are, where you come from. So that's why you see that difference between white Hispanics and non-Hispanics. You will be treated differently if you have a dark skin. And race is an issue, it's a difficult question to answer for many Hispanics, because some of us are not necessarily white or Black, or has some variations of colors that it's hard to classify. So that's why we talk in terms of non-white, because that's actually the more broad category where you can capture the bigger group. But essentially, race goes beyond that when it comes to police.
You know, it's interesting because we've done research on multiculturalism in media, and we have found a similar type of trend in that work, where if you are mixed race, if one of those races is white, you actually have very different responses to culture and very different touch points culturally than if one of your races is not white. It's, for example, Asian and Black, or Hispanic and Black, etc. And it's interesting to see that that same trend carries over here when it comes to the emotional resonance of all these different social advocacy areas, and in particular, police brutality and that feeling of trust. And I will also say, we had a long conversation, again, for our research fans in this group, around research design about this. And this is something we spent a lot of time on, is making sure that we were digging into some of the nuance behind race. And as Lisa pointed out earlier, that we were recognizing the difference between culture and race. One of the things we also learned in this study is when it comes to movements like Black Lives Matter, it might be intuitive to think that other underrepresented minorities would be the biggest allies in this type of cause. But that's not always the case. They might have their own issues to worry about. So I want to explore that a little bit as it relates to Black Lives Matter on the next slide, because we saw a finding here that kind of surprised us, which is that we asked people, you know, agree or disagree. I'm too exhausted from the stress of the pandemic to worry about Black Lives Matter. We were surprised to see the highest level of agreement among Asian Americans. 2 in 5 Asian Americans agree with that, versus only 1 in 6 Black Americans felt too exhausted to be able to address Black Lives Matter. And if you look at the context that's happening around that, Asian America has a lot of different issues to be worrying about in terms of discrimination right now with COVID-19. So, and this has been particularly prevalent in California with some incidences of bullying in schools of Asian American students, to the degree that it is now an area of research and conversation on both WebMD Is somebody else talking? On both WebMD as well as the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League's website. So they're starting to actually research this topic of bullying, and in particular Asian teen bullying as a result of COVID-19 and some of the rhetoric around the Chinese flu and things like that. So sometimes we have to look at the duality of the context there and realize that different underrepresented groups are dealing with their own challenges and may not have the emotional energy to deal with the other challenges that are taking place. So that begs the question, who are the strongest allies? And I think many of you who've done research on this topic, on generations, will be unsurprised to learn that Gen Z was actually 4 times as likely as the rest of Americans to earmark police brutality as their #1 social cause. So this is a generation that's been really, really driving some of that conversation and some of that advocacy. And there are pretty distinct generational differences here. If you go to the next slide, we looked at the intersection of Gen Z plus millennials as one group, so that's the 18 to 39-year-old cohort, and then Gen X plus boomers, which is the 40-plus cohort. And you can see across every racial group, white, Asian, mixed, or Black, that there's actually a fair amount higher advocacy for police brutality among 18 to 39-year-olds than there is among 40-plus. And we wanted to take a little bit of time to explore why that might be and understand what is it about this that's really resonating with younger generations. If you go to the next slide, that takes us to our second theme, which is hashtag advocacy. And the idea that hashtag advocacy is both friend and foe. So you can certainly see from this data on 18 to 39-year-olds that hashtags can catalyze change. It's particularly effective with younger generations, but they can also confuse and divide people, both on social platforms and in real life, or IRL, as they say on social media. So let's take a little bit of a dive into that. We learned 3 realities of hashtag advocacy in this particular study. One is that it's often led by younger generations, regardless of the hashtag. It's led by younger generations, and though it's well-intentioned, it tends not to be generationally inclusive in moving the needle on advocacy. And in fact, sometimes it can actually be highly divisive and miss the mark in appealing to the very groups that it's trying to serve. So let's walk through some examples of that in particular. We asked people about a series of different hashtags, and for those of you who think that the advocacy might have been just things that tend to skew left politically, we asked about some things that tend to skew right politically as well. So we asked about Black Lives Matter, but we also looked at All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, Build the Wall, some of the other hashtags that were trending over the past couple of years. And we asked people, what have you used? And what we found by generation is that 8 in 10 boomers had never used any of these hashtags. And I will credit Delphi, and we'll come back to her with giving us the heads up to expect that there's a generational difference here in who hashtags at all on either side of the political spectrum about any topic. And you can see that becomes a little more common. Hashtagging is a little more common with Gen X and really starts to take off with millennials and Gen Z. So some of this work around police brutality has really started to reach that 18 to 39 cohort, but not a 40-plus cohort that just isn't involved in this social media advocacy. The next slide. And sometimes these hashtags really hit the mark. Like Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of a hashtag that went viral for all the right reasons and really reached the group it was trying to advocate on behalf of. So we can see that, of Black Americans, 3 in 4 both support and like the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And that becomes less and less with different groups, but it's particularly important that we pick hashtags and slogans that appeal to the groups that they're trying to serve. And that worked really nicely with Black Lives Matter. If you go to the next slide, it's not as straightforward with something like defund the police. And that was when we had talked about a little bit internally that we can see, as many people just don't support them. This is, by the way, among Black Americans in particular, which is the group that defund the police is supposed to be serving the most. And what we found is that 1/3 of Black Americans do support and like this hashtag, but an equal number, 1/3, don't support the movement at all, and a group in between supports it but finds the hashtag misleading or confusing or even just too divisive to be effective. So there's not this universal support or opinion among Black Americans about that particular hashtag. And I'd like to turn it over to Delphine to talk a little bit about this, both from the perspective of generations and as the parent of a police officer. Delphine?
Yes, thanks, Carrie. So as Carrie mentioned, if we went back to the hashtag question, so I'm the older bunch in this collective. I'm on the older, I'm a baby boomer. Now, I'm not saying this for all baby boomers, but just when we were addressing that question, that kind of hit home for me because, first of all, I don't use hashtags. And I oftentimes find them confusing. When do you use them? When do you don't use them? So that whole notion resonated with me. So I had to put my 2 cents in there. And then this whole notion of defunding the police, it touched home with me too, because I have a police officer as a son. My son is a police officer, and he works for the Atlanta Police Department in the school systems. And we know that 15%, Black officers make up 15%, but for the population, we make up 12 to 13%. So we really over-index in this category. So when you talk about defunded police, and Damien will be addressing this, words matter. What do we mean by defund? Is that a positive? Is that a negative? So yeah, both of those things, yeah, Carrie, really resonated with me when we were doing this survey.
Absolutely. And like you said, Damien also comes from an LAPD family. You want to talk a little bit about that, Damien?
Yeah, no, and I think that's the thing that's interesting. My dad served as an LA County sheriff for 45 years, and then my uncle was an LAPD officer for almost 50. And for me personally, hearing defunded the police is, on one hand, like, is someone going to be out of a job or they not be able to eat, right? Because that was work. But on the other hand, it's also, I learned to understand that there is a very utilitarian and protective piece of the police department, right? And it does serve a function, but then does it always do that function well? No, right? So it feels like I'd be one of those people in the middle where I don't dislike it because I understand the intention behind it, but I think it's really missing the mark in terms of what it's trying to get you to say in terms of reallocate or reimagine or create a police force that's actually doing more help than harm.
Exactly, and that's why we're going to be really focusing all of our work moving forward on unpacking the language of all of this, as Lisa said up front. You know, our choice of words really does matter in how we speak about things, and it can matter for good and it can matter for bad, and it can just be confusing in some cases. So if you go to the next slide, Lisa, I'm going to kick it over to Damien to talk a little bit more about the role of media in general and how not just social media, but media at large might be contributing to some of this escalation and advocacy, but also some of the confusion and division that we're facing.
Thanks, Carrie. So, I mean, this is something we've all heard or maybe even said ourselves, right? Like, it's social media that's driving us apart. It's creating these bubbles, and we're all in our bubble, and it's an echo chamber. But what we wanted to understand is that really the case? Is that really what's driving some of the confusion and some of the division we're seeing in the country? So what we'll see on the next slide is that we took a dive into that. And one of the things that you'll find perhaps not surprising is that, yes, there was a correlation between heavy social media use and heavy news consumption. We can't determine causality, but there is a very strong correlation with that. And what we see is that actually has a substantial impact on sort of the real life interactions we're having with people around these topics. So on the next slide, that really comes to life when we ask people about their breakup. You know, did you stop talking to a friend or a family member? And you see on the left, people who don't use much social media, it was about a quarter of them had broken up with a friend or a family member or stopped talking to them. But as social media and news outlet consumption increases, that more than doubles. So we get to about half having had that same experience, but breaking up now because of one of these polarizing issues, meaning that there's something in that that's really, really, it's cementing itself and creating a divide that's bigger than the normal conversation we would have outside of social media or outside of the news. So with that, then it begs the question, are we then just in our bubbles watching this different news, or are we talking to different sources? And what we'll see on the next slide is we're not actually in as much of a bubble as you would think. There's only 1% of the population that said they were exclusively looking at liberal news outlets, and only 3% said they were looking exclusively at conservative news outlets. However, what you'll see is that there's probably a bigger mix in the middle that's moving between the two. It's a lot more fluid. So how are we really seeing this division? It's not the news outlets necessarily or the content itself. It means that there must be something else in the conversation that's really creating that divide. And so we wanted to get to what the crux of that is, what's really driving that division. And that's really what led us to the next part about words and what's that vocabulary and are we potentially missing each other in our conversations. So on the next slide, we'll really jump into what that means. This whole conversation is something that's been around for a while, but not all of these words have been around the same amount of time. Some of them are new, like white fragility. That's kind of a new thing coming onto the horizon. Whereas discrimination and equality, those words have been used for a long time. And with that, what we discovered is that some of these newer words, people just don't know what they are. Or when they do know what they are, there's either a misunderstanding or there isn't a consensus around the definitions, or we see that the words are constantly morphing as language does, and sometimes taking on positive, sometimes taking on negative, sometimes taking on positive and negative connotations, which of course makes now everything much more rife for confusion and division. So let's jump right into one of these words as an example. A word that we've all probably heard and even used or seen somewhere is discrimination. And when we asked our respondents to actually define and discuss discrimination, what we found was that there was consistency around how they defined it, what it meant. People could all kind of get behind it, that discrimination was somehow someone being negated or having benefits removed for some believed difference. But when we looked at our more recent words that have come into the social media and social justice lexicon, like virtue signaling or white fragility or microaggression, there was a lot less awareness, but we also saw that the definitions were much different. Words like virtue signaling have started to take on both a positive and negative connotation, where sometimes it's used derisively or as a condescending remark, like, oh, you're virtue signaling now. You think you're better than me. But sometimes it's used for people to say, I really want to express the things that I stand for and what I really mean when I'm saying, like, Black Lives Matter. So in that, if you're talking to someone and you're like, hey, yeah, it's all about virtue signaling, that could come across to someone else as being condescending and negative, while the other person may take it as, oh, wow, you really understand those virtues that I'm trying to extol to the world. Again, all of this it's new, it's developing, but when you asked about how people defined it, you'll see that there were differences in the definition. And on our next slide, that'll become very apparent. Microaggression. It's one of those terms that you hear everyone being, their psychologist, their inner psychologist comes out and we're all talking about microaggressions. But it's not actually very well known. When we asked overall, it was only about 29% of the population understood what or knew what that word was. And when we look at within those groups that it's supposedly seeking to help, it was actually pretty low as well. Even more interesting is that as we talk about microaggressions and ask people to define it, we discovered that there are some discrepancies in the terminology being used. And here's some thought starters or things that came up in our own conversations in this group and with other people as well. If we think about a microaggression, one thing that happens is you get a haircut and you're Black and someone wants to pet your hair. That's not very cool, right? People don't like that, but to call that a microaggression seems like you're somehow diminishing the invasiveness of it, right? If it's something that happens to you on a regular basis, it's no longer micro, it's macro. So for someone to call it micro makes it feel like, oh, it's not important, like the impact of it isn't substantial. The same with Asian Americans, right? You call something a microaggression, but you hear, oh, that Chinese flu, and you keep saying that enough, and it's starting to result in kids being bullied or someone feeling not safe in their own environment. Is that truly micro or is it macro? Whereas the goal of the word is to really communicate those transgressions that are less egregious. I think the thing that needs to be taken into account is that if you're on the other side of that transgression, it may actually still be just as egregious as something else. And so understanding where people are coming from in terms of where we're starting with our words is really has a huge impact in how brands and companies not only have these conversations with their employees internally, but how they communicate what the company really stands for and those causes that they may support. And Carrie alluded to this perfectly at the beginning of our conversation. So one of those things that really is going to become important in that conversation and why it's part of our name, we'll see on the next slide, is the dual meaning of equity. Equity is a word that we've all heard of. It has that meaning of, finance, your ownership, somehow benefiting from something financially. But it also has the notion of fairness, right? Of allowing two people or two entities to both succeed. And there's no, I don't think it's a mistake that those words are both meaning the same, or both of those meanings pertain to the same word, being that a lack of social or access or racial equity has a material impact on financial and overall living equity, right? If you can't get a job, or you're constantly held back in your promotions because of your skin color, your religion, or whatever it is, it has a substantial impact on your actual finances, aka equity. So let's jump right into that. Asking, this is one of those terms that of course we all know has been around for a while. Finance has been here for forever. When we asked people to define it, interestingly, we saw that split of the two definitions. Some people refer to it as, this is all about fairness. Others said, hey, I know about this in terms of like selling a house or getting stocks. So having both of those top of mind it's hugely important, but I think the key here especially in diversity and inclusion issues is we can't talk about one without the other, because without access to that financial piece, it makes it much more difficult for people to live. But without equity in terms of the social and understanding, you can't get to the financial piece. They're unfortunately inextricably linked together. And when we get to the next slide, what we'll see is this is materially something that people are experiencing every day. We wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a theoretical exercise, and point out why this is important for companies to talk about this with both their employees, but also in terms of how they conduct business. And when we look at how ethnic minorities and underrepresented groups have fared versus people who are white in the country, looking at age, gender, race as a reason for not getting a job, you'll see that they're almost twice as likely to have not received a job because of that, or to perceive that as being the reason. When we look at being fired, it's the same thing, almost twice as likely. All of these things at the end of the day mean you're not going to do as well, you're not going to have the money you need, you may not feed your family, you're going to have stresses, emotional tolls. And internally for a company, it also has a really big impact on just the morale and how your team works together, and potentially even churn. Taking even a deeper dive into that, understanding groups specifically, looking at Black Americans, they're nearly 3 times more likely than other Americans, especially white Americans, to say they've been fired from a job. So if you think about that, there's always sort of, for some people, this looming idea over their head that what's going to be next. And can you imagine the stress if you think, well, if I'm not perfect, or if I don't get what X person expects of me, I'm going to be the one they fire instead of Bob or whomever. And even looking across other ethnicities, so we see that asked if they didn't get a job because of their race. Black Americans are almost twice as likely to say that. But when we look at Hispanic, non-white Hispanics specifically, we see that they're more than twice as likely as well. So again, to Michaela's point earlier, a lot of this we see happen as skin gets darker, right? It's not so much the race itself, but the context within which it's seen. And so for each of these groups, they're starting to see that idea of equity, not getting their fair share, has a material impact on everything else that's downstream. What house you live in, what neighborhood you live in, what school your kids go to, and it becomes a very difficult cycle to break. It impacts morale at work, all of those things. So that's why we as a collective really came together to want to figure out how can we help companies talk about this in a way that's impactful, but also takes into account the complexities and all of the different facets that are always moving and dynamic in this conversation. So with that, I'll pass it back to Lisa to really kind of sum up those insights that we discussed and give you a kind of a background of what our next steps are going to be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Damien. This is really such an insightful presentation, and it's been an absolute thrill to work with all of you guys on the collective. So let's really unpack what we've learned. First things first, don't be rash. The expectation of immediate responsiveness to current events is really the wrong expectation if your communications team haven't been studying language and diverse population priorities all along. Number 2, it's critical to recognize that your social comms strategy is not one-dimensional. When it comes to racial justice and anti-discrimination work, you need to define your strategy across a wide spectrum and really keep that generational lens in focus. 3, inclusive language is key, and there are missteps that can be had here, so be very, very careful. The language of allyship can in itself be exclusionary, as Carrie touched on. 4, understand the language that resonates with your target. The pithier and newer the language, the less clear and unifying it can be. And that's perhaps fine if you're, a brand that targets a niche audience or targets Gen Z, but is probably not okay for everyone else. And last but certainly not least, as a brand, you really need to expand your understanding of communities in real life, or as Carrie would say, IRL. She's so hip. You really can't learn what the totality of Black America wants and needs by simply reading Twitter or Instagram, which leads us to our primary takeaway. We need to foster more unifying, thoughtful, and inclusive conversation. And this really requires 3 things: resources, commitment, and research. The research we conducted has really helped to substantiate the notions we had all along, that words matter. And we need to do a better job of understanding the various nuances and meanings our messages have in order to really reach the myriad of groups that represent our country. So before we get into our panel to discuss today's findings in more detail, our collective would like to share with you our next steps. So over the next year, our team will be tackling several projects. First up will be Words Matter, with 2 critical goals in mind. Number 1, before we can start messaging to people in a meaningful and authentic way, we need to understand the language of diversity, as well as the definitions and narratives of racial equity. Otherwise, brands are really going to struggle to speak thoughtfully about topics like Black Lives Matter. And number 2, our team will be raising funding for this multi-study project in partnership with Collaborata, and Jimmy is here today to assist us in understanding how Collaborata works with various companies to help champion this kind of research effort. And this endeavor will include both qualitative and quantitative elements and really curate a roadmap for developing universal and unifying vocabulary in order to truly inspire positive change. So there are 3 questions that we're going to be addressing in this upcoming research. Number 1, how can brands inspire conversation in an authentic and really impactful way? 2, what is the right language to use in anti-racism and DI efforts, and how does this vernacular differ for various cohorts? And number 3, what is the most unifying vocabulary and approach that paves the way for truly productive conversations and anti-discrimination policy? And here's where we need your help, folks. Our collective is actively looking for brands to commit and to contribute. So if anyone listening in today is interested, here's my email address. Feel free to reach out directly to myself or anyone here on the webinar, or you can certainly contact us at voicesofequity.com. So with that, I will pass it over to Delphine to lead our collective in a panel discussion. Delphine?
Thank you, Lisa, so much. And again, Damien and Lisa and Carrie, thank you for walking us through the survey results. And again, as Carrie mentioned, it's just a snippet. We only share just a portion. What I want to do, I want to start off with asking some questions of our Multicultural Insights Collective. And the first question I want to ask, and I think the attendees, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon as well, but what made you join and why do you stay? And I'd like to take a stab at answering that first. And to be honest with you, the reason why I joined at first was because of Carrie. I've known Carrie for a while. We would see each other at conferences, and I saw Carrie and Lisa present at an Insights conference February in Las Vegas. And then shortly after that, she asked, I want to start this multicultural collective and talking about Words Matter. So at first it was because of that. But I'll tell you why I'm staying now is we talk about this weekly, and we have a diverse group of research experts on this panel in our collective, and we are passionate about what we are doing. So at first, yeah, it was because of a person, but now it's because of the collective that we have. And Candace is the newer on the blocks. Candace keeps us in line. She keeps us focused and on point. So Candace, why are you with us?
Hey everyone, thanks for the intro. I feel as though this is a great place for me to be, especially when it came to some of the results that were in the PowerPoint earlier, specifically where the younger generation always is getting involved, always is standing for change and finding ways to continue to stay in the conversation. That's totally my lane. And before meeting Carrie and I met, meaning she's a common denominator for my reason to join as well. We met as I was really representing multicultural research at Refinery 29, a place where women of all creeds, all colors are there to be seen, to be heard, and to be able to claim their power. And I took a lot of those notions and a lot of those theories into a lot of the practices I do now that I practice market research on my own. This is a great place for me to still be able to unify those thought processes and join just such a great team who has a different perspective in different areas where I haven't touched, but it's allowing us to be more informed and better allies. So that's why.
And thank you, Candace. And I'm gonna save our presenters for last. I want to talk to Jimmy next. Jimmy, what about you? And while you're talking, Jimmy, please tell us about this collaborative effort that we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, for why I joined, you may all have noticed, but I am the only white male of the group. So I do view it as my responsibility to listen a lot, to learn, and to grow. I joined because I believe in the group's mission about adding diversity of all kinds, not just racially, but generationally, geographically, culturally, religiously. That's the idea. But I think I joined for two main reasons. The first is as a Jewish person, being just 2 generations removed from persecution. It's that cultural identity that helped shape my worldview. The synagogue my grandfather and great-grandfather were presidents of played a really active role in the civil rights movement of the 60s. The Rabbi Beanstalk marched with Dr. King and Selma. So this idea that Jews who have been persecuted for 1,000 years should be standing up against persecution of all kinds has been ingrained in me. The second is, as a researcher, just kind of in our nature to ask questions. It's an uncovered truth. That's what we do. And I love the idea of finding a way within this profession to make a difference. So I'm thrilled to be working with so many smart and caring people that I'm learning a lot about. For the second part of that question, so what does Collaborate do and how can you all get involved? So what we do, we bring together multiple organizations to share the cost and results of what we call exceptionally ambitious research. And for this project, I would say this is perhaps our most ambitious research we've ever tried to undertake, with so many different groups involved going after such a tough project. So the collaborative model allows brands of varied means and sizes in different industries, sometimes even in different countries, to come together to share in the development, to share the cost, and to share the results. For this specific project that we're talking about, for Words Matter, I don't think it could be more timely, more urgent, or frankly, more overdue. Brands don't have the benefit of ignoring our country's social conscience any longer. And they might not have the benefit of ignoring their own employees' subconscious biases either, which I think understanding the language makes a big difference. So when brands do respond or engage in that conversation, they ought to be prepared to do so tactfully, with empathy and with, frankly, a coherent understanding of the words within that conversation. So if you want your company to get involved, I think Lisa's email was up there earlier. Go to voicesofequity.com, go to collaborata.com. And by the way, I think all of your companies ought to get involved, so please reach out to us. We're looking forward to working with you all.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And Michelle, what about you?
Okay, I have another Carrie story. Carrie,
I'm gonna save Carrie for last.
My ego's gonna blow up, guys.
yeah, we met initially at an Insights Association conference, and then we hit it off, start talking about other things and the way we work as researchers. And when this idea came up, and she asked me if I was interested, and if I look back in my long history in the research industry. I see the industry really struggling with diversity and inclusion the same way that other industries do right now. And I give you a couple of examples. You hardly see multicultural researchers in agencies and corporate research groups. Multicultural research is really often missing in many marketing strategy plans, and there is no budget for it. And if there is any budget, it's really small. And in general, even for our audiences, the ones that we're trying to study, we know how difficult it is to find diverse groups in panels. We know how hard and difficult. Low incidence is the key word for Hispanics and Blacks, and that means harder to get and more money to spend. You need to do that. And so when Carrie said, what about this? I say, yes, of course, sign me up. I really would like to make a contribution. I meet many of the check boxes, biracial and immigrant and Hispanic and women and all that, and having a place where you can be heard is one of the reasons why I stayed. Also, there is a very high spirit of collaboration in this group, and diversity is appreciated. So we are very respectful. We discuss every week, and we are able to say things that we might not be able to say in other contexts, but here we can discuss it and find a way of working together.
Thank you, Michelle. I call Lisa and Carrie the dynamic duo, but Damien, let me hear from you, and then I'm going to move on.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions too, please feel free to add them in the chat and ask us. But for me, it was Carrie's the connector, so she's a story for all of us. We all connected with Carrie somehow, but we used to work together quite a while ago. I won't say how long because it'll age me, and I like to pretend like I'm younger. But and for me, it was really something that was much more personal. A while back in April or May, I wrote. It was right after Ahmaud Arbery had died. I wrote an article on LinkedIn, and it was because I realized I was afraid. I was going to go for a run, and Ahmaud Arbery had just died, and I was like, do I do this? Am I going to come home and see my wife and son? So for me, it was really a personal thing. And I wrote an article about pushing past that fear and how I refused to succumb to that. And instead, I wanted to do something to change that so that I wouldn't have to have that fear. So my son won't have to have that fear, right? And it just so happens that Carrie read the article and we started talking about this collective, and I thought this was my way to do that. It was a pandemic. I wasn't going to go out in March and do those things. That wasn't me, but I wanted to do something that I could have a material impact. And so being able to work in a way and provide information and strategy for a brand so that they can actually start to execute and make meaningful change internally actually has an impact on daily life for individual people. It also teaches people and helps people see that we all have biases of some sort. I do, everyone does, right? But it's okay to talk about them and work through them. We don't have to succumb to either fear or assumptions about other people. And I didn't want to be part of the problem by just assuming the worst. And instead, I wanted to assume the best intentions and try to understand and make sure that I could use that to help make things better than they were.
Wonderful, wonderful. What about you, Lisa? Why join? Why are you with us?
There's so many reasons. I mean, first of all, you guys are just an absolute joy to work with. I think there was something that happened shortly after George Floyd passed away and was murdered. My son, who happens to have autism, said to me, he's like, "Mom, how could someone be killed for the color of their skin?" He's like, we're all pink inside. I don't understand it. And I thought it was just like, I mean, he often gives me a lot of aha moments. He has his entire life. But I think, hearing from a child that in some ways has been marginalized because of his disability, right? We're talking about diversity, and diversity means many things to many people. We've learned that here in our research. But it really just struck me that, just simply retweeting Black Lives Matter or sharing out different posts, it just felt so performative to me. And I mentioned that earlier at the top of the presentation. I just wanted to do something that was actionable, to show my son that you're right. We're all pink on the inside, and that's all that should matter. And so that was like a big driver for me to get involved. And really the second reason was I just felt like it was a tremendous learning opportunity for me as a person, as a researcher. And I always say you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so you can listen more and talk less. And you guys know I talk a lot, that's for sure. But I just feel this has been such a great opportunity to learn from all of you and hear from your different perspectives. And it's been an absolute blessing. And I'm just absolutely so excited to see what we do next.
Thank you, Lisa. And Carrie, I know that the head might be coming over just a little bit, but why this? Why the Multicultural Insights Collective?
I share and I echo pretty much everything that's been said. I think for me, I had a similar reaction to Lisa about this, where I just felt like a level of empathy where I felt like, there was a knife to the heart with all of these murders earlier this year. And like Jimmy, I come from a Jewish background, and my parents were actually alive during World War II. I'm very fortunate that they already lived in the United States. They were, I think, third generation United Americans at that point. But I wouldn't be here if they were in Europe. It's really literally that simple. And so I was raised passing as white, but also with a belief system of you never take anything for granted. That could be taken away from you in a second. And I think that's just kind of informed a lot of my life choices, and how I think about the world and how I advocate for others. And, when Black Lives Matter really resurfaced as a movement earlier this year, I thought I have to be part of the solution. And I started thinking about, I as one person and as a small business owner can be, but this doesn't really get where it needs to go until, to Jimmy's point, it is a big, comprehensive, swing for the fences kind of initiative. And other people have to be involved for us to pull that off. And it needs to be a more diverse group than one small team, my team, can accomplish. And we need to have, diversities of backgrounds, whether it's, gender or culture, heritage, language, generation. And so I started, frankly, building my dream team, who are all the people that I've come across in my career that I just think share value system, want as badly as I do to be part of the solution. And also share that discipline of research. I mean, Michelle, you referred to that in terms of some of the mechanics of doing research. And I share all of those frustrations from a professional standpoint. Every single time I field a research study where we want to get a large cohort of underrepresented minorities, it's a slog, right? And I've been slogging through that for over 20 years. And sorry, Damien, I just dated us. But this is a problem I ran into in the 90s, and we haven't made progress on it, frankly, as a research industry. And I thought, we're overdue. And instead of complaining about this, I need to be part of the solution. And so for me, this was about building a team of people who could drive that solution and do so with both heart and discipline. And I think that's kind of where all this came to. And then the weekly meetings are just so thoughtful, and I'm learning from so many different people, which is something as a small business owner you don't always get to do. We've got like 6 different business owners in this group, and what a treat to get to work with such a cross section. That's not normally something that you get to experience, in the type of work that we do. So that's been a real treat for me, and I think keeps me coming back, and I hope fighting the good fight.
Well, thank you. So we have a few more questions that I want to ask the panelists, but I also, those that are still with us, attendees, please feel free to drop a question if you want. There's a question button. You can just scroll down, type us a questions, and I'll kind of keep a check on it. And Lisa, if you would just help me with our timing, but we do have a few more minutes, and I gotta ask Michelle a question. I call her our methodology guru. So what can researchers do in their research design to better address equity in data collection and insights?
Well, as I hinted before, one of the main reasons I came to this group is just trying to get things better for the industry. And we know that particularly when it comes, for example, to audience representation. So there are main 3 areas. You have the audience, you have the actual design, and you have the people who do the research, right? And so in terms of the audience, panels or any sample source that we now use has to invest the money into getting access to those groups. then the brands need to be willing to invest in paying for that and putting market research, multicultural research into the context of the marketing and put investment in that. So that would be one thing. The other one is when it comes to design, if we just take the example of, an example of the survey design, we have this big discussion at the beginning on how to design, how to capture the Hispanic aspect of the population. And of course, it's easier if you bunch them together and you make it exclusive, because it's easier to track quotas. And I kept insisting we need to separate race from being Hispanic, because it's not the same thing, it's a different dimension. Although most Hispanics now, if you ask them what race you are, they say other, because normally culturally we have been pushing the fact that you are not white, you're nothing else than Hispanic. And so that creates a problem for the analysis. So we kept those two questions separate, and created a lot of problems for Lisa's team. we had more than 50 quotas to track, and it was painful and costly, but now we have the ability to really see inside and really capture the nuances, and the analysis is much richer. But that means that both sides of the equation has to work together and invest. It's about money, essentially. And then the third option, the third issue is representation in the research teams. We need people who are part of the groups that we are studying. We need people of different races and ages in the research teams and in the marketing teams, so they can really understand when we talk what we mean and what is really the relevance of what we're saying and researching. And so those three areas will really help to make a tighter, better designs, more representative of the people we're trying to talk to.
Thank you. And I really had another question for you, but I'm looking and it looks like we're running close on time. And I know we talked a lot about Black Lives Matter, defund the police. So I want to try and get this question in. Why isn't the Black community behind defund the police? We talked about a little bit, but does anyone want to share before I turn it back over to Lisa? Because I think we just have a few minutes.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think one of the things that's difficult about that term, that phrase, the hashtag, whichever you want to call it, is it feels sensationalized, right? It's catchy, it gets your attention, it says something dramatic, but the underlying context for what it's meaning to communicate is something very different than the actual hashtag or phrase itself. Defund the police means just that, take money away from the police. I mean, defund means take money away. But what it's really trying to say, or seems to be wanting to advocate, is let's reimagine policing. That may be moving money from policing to something else. It may be moving money around in the police force to build out something that's less militaristic, right? But it's defunded the police is just the catchier, easy hashtag, but it doesn't do justice to what I think people are truly asking for what they want. And as a result, you get some people who are reacting to the intention behind the phrase. And so they're all about it because they're thinking of the intention. You have some people who are reacting to the actual phrase itself, so they can't get beyond that to understand the intention. And then you have people who are in the middle saying that this is going to completely derail everything that we're talking about because some people aren't going to get it. And so with those three groups, as a result, you don't have any consistent, like I can't speak for all Black people, but I've heard that there isn't a consistent message because there isn't a consistent understanding of what it means.
Exactly, exactly. I don't see any questions. I just checked our questions, Lisa. And so I think with just a minute left, I would like to turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Lisa, there actually are a couple of questions. I don't know if they're just coming to me, maybe.
Yeah,
I'm able to see them. You can see them? Okay, cool. Do you want to address them or would you like me to?
Why don't you go for it, Carrie? I mean, we only have about a minute left, so I will say if we can't get to every question, which we won't, we'll make sure to follow up with those that submitted those questions. Sure. Also be sending a recording out to everyone. So Don't worry.
Awesome. So that answers one of the questions. And one of the questions was also, will we be sending out a copy of this? And yes, it'll actually be available on voicesofequity.com as well. It will be uploaded after this, and you'll be able to request a copy of it there. And then there was a question too, talking about our point about where Asian Americans fell on advocacy and allyship around Black Lives Matter. And they were asking, where do Hispanics fall on that? And the answer is kind of at parity with the overall population. So from an allyship, we pointed out the groups where there was a strong skew one way or the other. The groups we didn't point out tended to fall around national average.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. How quickly an hour goes. Time flies. We're having fun, guys. So I just want to say thank you all so much for the incredible work that we've been doing our last few months. It's been an absolute joy to work with all of you. And I want to also say thank you to our attendees. We've had over 100 people tuning in today. I think we peaked at about 150 people watching us live. So for all of you out there, thank you so much. And we'll look forward, hopefully, to connect with you all in the very near future. You can reach out to me personally at lisa@innovatemr.com or check us out on our website, voicesofequity.com, and certainly reach out to any of the folks here as well. And we'll look forward to connecting, hopefully, in the near future, and have a wonderful, wonderful day ahead. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.